Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neil Shader, and I am the Communications Director for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. This afternoon, we will hear from DEP Secretary Patrick McDonnell, Rafiyqa Muhammad of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, Secretary Cindy Dunn from the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and Secretary Russell Redding from the Department of Agriculture to talk about the 2021 Climate Impacts Assessment Report. At the conclusion of the discussion, we will be taking questions from reporters. A few housekeeping notes. We are streaming this event via both WebEx and Facebook. However, we will only be accepting questions from reporters via the WebEx stream. Reporters, please go ahead and type your question into the chat box, and we can go ahead and take care of those. And again, we will address those at the end. Thank you, and I would now like to introduce Patrick McDonnell, Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Neil. Good to be with you all here today. Since 2008, DEP's produced climate impact assessments every 3 years in accordance with our Climate Change Act. And for each report, we've partnered with Penn State University and environmental consultants to analyze state, local, and federal data to track how our climate has changed and determine how it's likely to continue to change into mid-century and beyond. For this year's report, which was released earlier today, we analyzed 6 climate change hazards that Pennsylvania is likely to see. I want to highlight 3 in particular because modeling showed them to carry the highest risk statewide. These are rising average temperature, increased heat waves, and increased frequency of heavy rainfall events. Now to unpack that, we're talking about a combination of climate hazards. At the same time, our average temperature rises steadily upward, we'll have more intense heat waves more often. And while overall it may rain less often, we're going to be hit with more heavy rainfall events. Our state average annual temperature is expected to be 5.9 degrees hotter by mid-century, and that's compared to a 1971 to 2000 baseline. The average number of days each year that we're going to experience over 90 degrees is likely to increase to 37, and in some areas 60. And again, for perspective, that's compared with 5 days per year in the 1971 to 2000. So where before we were experiencing less than a week, we'll now be experiencing 5 weeks or more of 90 degree or better temperature. We're likely to see 8% more rainfall. And as I mentioned, the takeaway here is it will come in the form of more frequent heavy rainfall events that cause both inland flooding and coastal sea level rise. With these projected changes, no one can expect Pennsylvanians' lives to stay as they are now. The Climate Impacts Assessment outlines the risks we are facing. Pennsylvanians' health will be at catastrophic risk from heat waves, which are the #1 cause of weather-related fatalities in the United States. This has major implications for the many Pennsylvanians who work outside, for example, in construction or farming, or who have underlying health conditions or don't have easy access to air conditioning. There'll be an additional level of risk for more than 3.7 million Pennsylvanians who live in over 1,000 environmental justice communities statewide. These communities are nearly twice as likely as the statewide average to experience days over 90 degrees. After almost a century of disinvestment, residents in our EJ communities already face major challenges, such as living near industrial sites with poor air quality and living in older housing stock, often without sufficient air conditioning. If you also have limited transportation options and can't get to a cooler location, a heat wave can easily become a critical health threat. Turning to Pennsylvania's forests and ecosystems, our report projects significant risk from rising temperatures. Some plant and animal species will face multiple stresses, such as decreased habitat, an increase in pests and competitive invasive species, and disruptions to natural cycles such as migration, hibernation, and leaf development. And our farms are at critical risk from flooding. Crop producers are likely to see income losses from planting delays, repeated damage to planted fields, and being unable to harvest. Livestock producers who grow their own feed and forage will experience these impacts as well. The extended rainfall in 2018 shows the prolific statewide crop damage that can result from these events. Rafiyqa Muhammad, Secretary Dunn, and Secretary Redding will share their views on climate change impacts on environmental justice areas, our forests, and our farms. And I urge you all to read the 2021 Climate Impacts Assessment to learn about the many more impacts projected for our infrastructure, economy, recreation, and other aspects of life in Pennsylvania. The purpose of projecting these climate impacts is to spur climate action. It's clear that if we're going to protect Pennsylvania from the most direct impacts of climate change, we've got to work now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And a key first step is the governor's effort to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative to reduce emissions from power plants. Over 14,000 Pennsylvanians have weighed in on RGGI, and the vast majority have been strongly in favor of Pennsylvania joining now as a concrete step to fight climate change. Economic modeling shows RGGI will bring Pennsylvania over $300 million a year for state government to directly invest in deployment of energy efficiency, development of clean energy sources, and creation of new jobs. RGGI funds will be used to make targeted investments in both our energy generating communities and our environmental justice communities. Having funds to develop new jobs and workforce training in the clean energy sector, as well as support environmental cleanup and water and air quality improvements, will turn the climate challenge into an opportunity to improve many Pennsylvanians' lives. Many other actions that will mitigate climate change impacts statewide are detailed in the Pennsylvania Climate Action Plan and other materials that can all be found on DEP's website at dep.pa.gov/climate. The important thing, though, is that we start to take action. Taking action now may make the next climate impacts assessment a much more positive one. I thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Neil.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We will now hear from Rafiyqa Muhammad of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board. Rafiyqa?
There was a few things that I wanted to share. I did read through the report and did read through the plan, and I looked at this as a lot of opportunities. Just what Secretary McDonnell just mentioned and what he has shared with all of us is sometimes the solution is in the problem. When you see terms constantly through the report saying catastrophic, devastation, inland flooding, and the list goes on and on. By me being a resident living in an industrial city or an industrial site, which Harrisburg, our capital, is, I see these things all the time, consistently every day. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a severe windstorm. I know we're talking about mid-century, but then I'm also, as I was reading through this plan, I'm looking at right now, today, we're not in mid-century. We just had a lot of devastation over the weekend. Again, just crazy storms coming out of nowhere. We have severe flooding here in Harrisburg. We can get a rainstorm and have flooding immediately. We do have mudslides that do happen in our city and are in our communities, very dense populated communities, particularly people of color, Black and Latino communities. We also, which I did not see in the report, and maybe someone can talk about it or maybe echo or maybe something that I overlooked. Harrisburg is plagued with sinkholes. There's something that I don't see mentioned or talked about a lot. I know it's throughout our state, but I'm looking right here in my own backyard. So we also have opportunities as well as I think I mentioned as far as mudslides, but also when we talk about our heat wave index. We don't have to look at mid-century. Every summer we have people that are dying here in our city because of heat wave index. So living this now, living this every day in environmental justice cities and communities, we need to take action immediately. We can't wait till mid-century. We need to be doing small things now. And I'm very proud and have an opportunity to work with all of you to help make those action steps become a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafiyqa. And now we will hear from Secretary Cindy Dunn of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Secretary?
Hi, everybody. I'm calling in from Butler, Pennsylvania, and happy to join all of you in this sobering report on the climate impacts assessment. I read it over the past couple of days and must say was a bit distraught by some of the early impacts of climate change we are currently feeling in Pennsylvania and will feel in the very near future. And frankly, I found myself looking at my own span of life and thinking about nieces and nephews and a great niece in the span of her life and the impacts that she will feel as a 1-year-old over the course of her lifetime if we don't act immediately. And as Patrick McDonnell has said, the point of this isn't to distress us all, it's to think about actions that we can take. But some of the impacts I'll be talking about are on forest ecosystems and wildlife that are at risk from these rising temperatures. For instance, not surprisingly, tree species in DCNR, we manage the forest of Pennsylvania. And some of the ranges of a lot of these tree species will really shift. Southern species that you might see on a vacation right now, you may find in Pennsylvania, like loblolly pine. Trees that are important to us, like our state tree, the northern hemlock, will become possibly extirpated in Pennsylvania because climate change impacts increase the hemlock woolly adelgid, an invasive pest species on hemlock, and it's making it very difficult and costly to maintain our hemlock forests, and that's our state tree. Other species will move out of Pennsylvania to the north. We'll see big changes in animal species as well, and other plants, and there'll be multiple stresses, including changes in rainfall patterns and increased temperature. And also, when you think about this is something that Secretary Redding may mention as well, but pollinators and the need for plants to be pollinated, and that whether that's a crop species or a tree, but the trees and the plants bloom at a certain time, they've co-evolved with a certain pollinator, usually an insect in Pennsylvania. And if the timing is changed too much, the pollinator is not there when the tree blooms, and that creates a big problem, this mismatch of timing. Some wildlife species that we all know and care about, the eastern hellbender, which is our state amphibian, it has very specific habitat needs, and that will be affected by climate change. So really specific, narrow niche species like the hellbender may not make it, whereas some generalist species that can adapt to a wide array of habitats and conditions, like say the American robin, that we enjoy seeing the robins in our yards right now, they probably will do fine. They adapt to changing species. Again, invasive species of all kind do better in a warmer climate. So we're fighting, spending a lot of money on many invasive species of plants and on insects and other animals. So again, a lot of challenges there. On the recreation side of our mission, we see an increased demand for water sports. As temperatures get warmer and warmer, people are seeking water, whether it's for swimming, wading, fishing, just getting on the water. It's always a little cooler. Winter sports, we have a thriving winter sports tradition in Pennsylvania, whether it's skiing or snowmobiling. And of course, these sports will be on the decrease and are challenged even today. Now, we had a good snow year this past year, but if you look at the overall trends, our snow cover has declined dramatically, even over the past couple of decades. We're already seeing the climate-related issues that Patrick had mentioned, the increased heavy intensity storm events. In fact, in the Loyalsock State Forest, we saw 2 500-year floods 3 years apart. Statistically, that shouldn't happen. The second one blew out 6 miles of road and several bridges. It obliterated a forest road. I mean, you could hardly see that a road had ever been there. Again, 2 500-year floods in the span of a few years. We're seeing that across the system. We've had road washouts and bridge washouts, culvert washouts, campgrounds, a lot of damage to the park and forest infrastructure that people need so much, especially in the COVID pandemic. People have been flocking to the outdoors and really showing up in great numbers in their parks and forests, and the infrastructure there has been really challenged extra by the climate change effects. Something Rafiyqa said really rang true with me. She sees the opportunity and these challenges, and that's true of forest and natural areas as well. Some of the solution lies in the very things that are opportunities to combat climate change. Like, for instance, forested cover shade streams and shade cities. Even as we speak, we have a Tree Vitalize conference going on right now, and urban trees are critical in reducing summertime temperature in the cities. A lot of people don't realize it, but the number one killer weather event is heat, is summertime heat. People think about things like tornadoes and hurricanes, very dangerous. However, if you look at the numbers, it's summertime heat is the biggest killer, and it hits EJ communities the hardest. And so urban trees and trees anywhere cool the landscape and also sequester carbon and help us adapt and create some resilience to climate change. So again, there's some opportunity in all this, but it does require concerted action on everyone's part. So at DCNR, recognizing the importance of climate change to our mission, we began 5 years ago on a climate adaptation and resiliency plan. We have Greg Zarnecki, who's on this call, who is our climate leader in DCNR and who organizes our climate work as our lead. We are building more resilient infrastructure in the state parks and the forests, such as bottomless culverts and bigger culverts that are built for the water events and weather events and retain the natural connectivity in the streams. We're relocating trails and roads to less flood-prone areas. We're looking at the capacity of our dams. When you think about your favorite state park, chances are that lake is there because of a dam. We have 49 high hazard dams, 32 have some deficiencies. So again, the infrastructure question and looking at the ability of our dams and really strengthening and fixing the issues around our dams to adapt to the changing climate. Looking at planting trees and adjusting to trees that will do better in future climate conditions, and also identifying species that will be most resilient to climate change. And again, looking at how we can assist our communities, how we can assist the natural areas to be more resilient, to connect landscapes, to connect streamside forests, to plant buffers, to shade streams, to shade cities, and really help on the solution side in conservation and in recreation. And again, happy to be part of this. And again, I think the choice here is to agonize or to act. And I don't think we have a choice. I think it's time to act. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Now we will hear from Department of Agriculture Secretary Russell Redding. Mr. Secretary.
Hey, Neil. Yeah, thank you, Neil. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. Honored to join you today. Thank you to Governor Wolf and to Secretary McDonnell for prioritizing this issue. Very important. You know, the insight of the Climate Impacts Assessment Report will continue to drive our efforts as we work together to find sustainable solutions, or as Secretary McDonnell termed it, sort of spur the action. Absolutely. As we've heard throughout the discussions today, climate change will impact us all. But this also means that collectively, we can all be part of that answer. The Department of Agriculture are committed to sustainability and environmental stewardship, and our farmers are committed to tackling this issue head on to deal with the issues of flooding and drought and extreme weather and the invasive species that have been noted here. All of those patterns that farmers are experiencing firsthand and in real time are addressed in this impact report. Unfortunately, these events are no longer just the extreme. They are becoming the norm. And as seasons change and temperatures increase, what we grow, when we plant, when we harvest, all of that will change. Livestock and companion animals will face certainly the negative impacts of heat stress. And with that, of course, the animal health issues. It will also mean farmers will have to deal with increased costs of energy in cooling and the infrastructure expenses to reduce that stress. Increasing the temperatures also means increased invasive species. We're plagued by them now. As we know, as these invasive species, they are invasive in every way. We will see that continue, and we'll see them in different regions, and migrating to adapt to the climate change will also be part of what we see. So it's expanded, just not in the number of invasives, but where they appear will be one of the concerns. As we look at the consequences of climate change, it seems like a daunting feat. But I remain optimistic. I think the action, if we act now, if we listen to what the impact report is telling us, I believe that we can still play an active role and remain optimistic and meet these challenges. But it will take all of us. I can tell you that many of the farmers are already using these best management practices. They have them in place. They were there for water quality. We see them being critically important to climate resiliency and climate change. They're the Farmland Preservation Program. We lead the nation in farmland preservation, soil health, nutrient management, forest stewardship. Our collective challenge, I think, is to really look at these practices that we've adopted and how they can be further elevated to mitigate climate change. The industry is also stepping up. I want to give full credit. And a good example is the dairy industry in the Net Zero Initiative. This industry-wide effort will play a key role in helping dairy industry, which is one of our largest segments in Pennsylvania, continue to make progress towards greenhouse gas emission reductions and significantly improve water quality. It also is important to recognize that agriculture's role in environmental justice. Environmental justice and food sovereignty oftentimes go hand in hand. And creating access to healthy, sustainable foods means taking care of both the environment and people who inhabit that environment. Whether it's urban or rural, places in between, people cannot grow where they are planted unless they have healthy soil as a foundation and affordable, healthy food to help them grow strong roots. That is a foundation and agricultural principle. The Department of Agriculture is committed to environmental justice, sustainability, and addressing climate change. The agricultural industry is on the front lines of the negative impacts of climate, but we also believe that it is an opportunity to be on the front lines in the first wave of solutions that impact Pennsylvania and this world. So thank you, Mr. Secretary, for letting me be part of this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. We will now open it up to questions from reporters. Reporters, please do put your name and the outlet that you are writing with in the chat box, as well as your question. We're going to kick things off with a question from Paul Goff of the Pittsburgh Business Journal. Paul asks, what would the impact be of Pennsylvania joining RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, next year? Would it reduce climate change as outlined in the report? Also, if the state does not join RGGI, what would the impact be? Also curious about the impact of other nearby states that aren't taking action on climate and emissions. And finally, what else would need to change in terms of industry and energy production to reduce the likelihood of the forecast presented in the impacts assessment report?
Thank you. I'll take that one. And obviously a lot there. Even just starting with that last question, as I mentioned, we have a climate action plan in addition to the climate impacts report that we're releasing here. Our last climate action plan identified 19 areas that we think are priorities to address, and the fossil fuel industry is just one of those. So interestingly, within our state, transportation, industrial sources, and power generation all are very close to one another in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases produced. So it's not one thing, it's a lot of things that we'll need to address as we move forward. In terms of RGGI specifically, yes, you know, the way RGGI is structured is as a cap and invest program. And when we talk about climate, we're talking about it in two frames. The mitigation, how do we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, and adaptation. We are experiencing climate change, as Rafiyqa said. We're experiencing climate change now. So we are going to have to be doing adaptation. So with RGGI, we are both driving down the overall amount of emissions through the cap. We're also driving down the amount of emissions through use of the revenues, including things like energy efficiency. And those revenues can be used for some adaptation strategies potentially. Some of that requires, as we've said before, some legislation. And then in terms of other states, you know, obviously we are one state. There are other states, other countries that are impacting this issue. You know, the governor is leading on this, committing the state to 26% reduction by 2025, 80% reduction by 2050 through his executive order. There are a number of other states taking action, and we see a number of other companies, industries, financial markets, all starting to make decisions around this. So it's about how do we drive down our emissions, but also how do we prepare the state for what's coming environmentally, in the climate, and economically.
Thank you. Our next question is for Secretary Dunn. This is from Cassie Miller of the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Secretary Dunn, you mentioned that the state's 32 deficient dams. Are you and DCNR worried about the state of these dams, given what Secretary McDonnell said earlier about increased torrential rain events? And how big of a problem is this for the department?
Yeah, it is a big concern, and I think, you know, the prudent thing to do obviously is to pay a lot of attention to this and to measurably peel back the concern that we have. So we do have a total of over 149 dams in the system. We have, as I mentioned, 32 that have some structural deficiencies that are also considered high hazard. In other words, if they were to fail, there could be loss of life and certainly loss of property. So we focus on those high hazard dams, and of those, like I said, 32 have some deficiencies. We recently awarded contracts for design build for 6 of those, and we have out for bid, about 20 more. And again, in some cases, we're willing to do a dam removal if it's not a beloved state park lake. If it's a state park lake or something needed for recreation, of course, then we look to remediate or fix. When you think about these storm events that Secretary McDonnell was referring to, and I think we've all experienced this, you don't know where they're going to park themselves and just dump rain and dump rain and dump rain. And it's something, this phenomenon of these heavy rain events has just gotten worse and worse. I think we can all tell stories in our personal life of how we've seen this. So we never know where that event's going to park itself and just dump water. So it is a worry. And so we're looking to remediate the known deficiencies and do everything we can to make sure the downstream residents are safe from these dams. It takes a lot of funding, and that's why DCNR is certainly interested in continually seeking funding to bring back and upgrade our infrastructure throughout the park and forest systems. So thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Frank Coomer of the Philadelphia Inquirer, asking if someone can speak to the 5.9 degree temperature increase. Is that based on current national emissions? And is it based on low, moderate, or continued emission regimes?
This Pat McDonnell again. The base answer is it's based on existing global emissions. It doesn't matter, kind of where carbon or greenhouse gases are emitted. It has an impact, within Pennsylvania. So it's based on all the current models. The one thing I'd say, and I'm not the low, moderate, high emission piece. I think what you're getting at there is what are we looking at projecting forward, and it really is business as usual. So we're not looking at adapting to this going forward. We're not looking at putting in strategies or policies that would drive down greenhouse gases. This is assuming a business as usual scenario.
Thank you, Secretary. Somewhat of a related question from Laura Legier of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. How many of these projected impacts for mid-century are baked into the system because of past and current emissions?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Again, the answer is similar to what I just said. I think the key piece I would say, and I'm not sure if we have a specific percentage. Again, that's something can double check with staff. But I think the specific thing is because we're relying on business as usual, the reality is that gives us opportunity to really have an impact on the impacts. So by pursuing policies, by pursuing ways of further reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we can have a meaningful impact on, again, not just greenhouse gas emissions in Pennsylvania, but also adapting to those impacts that we know are coming.
Thank you. Julia Martinez of Argus Media asks, and this is going to be another one for you, Secretary McDonnell, how will the Wolf administration ensure that Pennsylvania will join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative next year with the current challenges presented by lawmakers? And what is the backup plan if 2022 implementation does not happen?
Sure. So, we are continuing to pursue the regulation. Just yesterday, we posted for Air Quality Technical Advisory Committee information related to the regulation. So if you haven't had an opportunity to review that, would encourage you to do that in advance of the Air Quality Technical Advisory Committee meeting. I think we still are hopeful that one of the things we've talked about in this is that under our existing regulatory authority, we can use the revenues in order to impact anything related to clean air pollution. There's obviously more things we can do, in particular in those traditional energy communities, as well as our environmental justice communities that might require further legislative authority. So we're pursuing both paths, right? The regulatory path, but also hopeful that we can come to some agreements on spending that revenue in a meaningful way in some of these communities.
Thank you. Question from Rachel McDevitt of State Impact Pennsylvania. Does the latest assessment show more severe anticipated effects of climate change than the last report? Are there any new challenges that this new report has brought to light? And are there any hopeful trends?
Sure, thank you. The couple things I'd say, one is in terms of the more severe, I think clearly the temperature is probably the significant one, the temperature and the heat wave numbers. I believe the last report, we didn't have a increase in 2018 and 2015. It was 5.4 degrees. So this represents a higher temperature impact. I forget the numbers on the heat waves, but can get back to you there. The 8% increase in precipitation is similar to what we were seeing before. I'd say the big difference between the last report and this one is we've actually experienced the impact of some of that weather now, and in terms of that 2018, those 2018 events, both in the ag sector as well as in the transportation sector in terms of impacts to our infrastructure. So in terms of hopeful trends, I think, you know, that within the impacts, as I said, we're looking at business as usual in terms of what we're assessing. I think the hopeful trend is we can take action on these things. We can reduce the impact that we are having on climate change, both you know, as a state, as a leader, but there's also, I think, a more robust federal dialogue around this as well in terms of the infrastructure bills and things like that. So I think there's definitely a lot of hope out there. This is the thing we're aimed at in terms of impacts and the numbers, but that leaves us a lot of space to really pursue a different future.
If I may add something, Neil, I would just say this assessment did a great job of incorporating more the impacts on the natural environment and the resiliency and ability to use the natural environment, to use forests to remediate some of the issues. And also this report engaged much more deeply with environmental justice, which is critical. And in that lies part of the solution to engaging the public more deeply and having people understand impacts and also engage people in the solutions. And some of the solutions are within people's reach as individuals and collectively decisions they make. So I do think that while the numbers are and impacts are somewhat scary, there's more hope and more ability baked into this report. I thought it was a really good job.
Neil, I would just like to piggyback off what Secretary Dunn just mentioned. When we talk about dealing with our communities, and really when we talk about solutions and when we're talking about action steps, it can be done. A lot of our communities just want education and information, which I see that we don't. I'm not saying we're not doing a good job, because we are, but sometimes it's the terms that we use, which may be over people's heads. I always use the term that we like to spoon-fed the information to the community so they can really digest it and understand. A lot of this is not hard. I know just before COVID-19 hit in 2020, we did a small climate action plan in Harrisburg to really get down to the grassroots community to really find out, do they understand what we're talking about? Do they care about their local environment? Do they know what's in their local environment? How does it impact them? And what small changes can they make? I can say that just through that, a lot of people would interest them the most. I think that I came away with a lot of people is interested in the light bulbs and how they can just go buy some light bulbs and don't have to continuously buy light bulbs, and how that can reduce just their energy bill. We had our water company there to talk about our water and how you can reduce your water bills. People really just wanted information. Once we give them the correct information and the how-tos and what to do, it seems like they kind of like follow suit. When we don't give the information and the proper information, people are a little confused, or sometimes they just don't do anything. So for me, when I hear about action steps, I really want to give people substance that they can actually follow and see immediately. 30 days, 60 days to see if your bills or something happened. They can see that it's tangible. They can touch it. They can feel it. They smell it, etc. Also, when I want to mention about when I see opportunity, I look at these as apprenticeships in different areas that we're sitting here talking about. When we talk about our forest, Harrisburg has a situation with trees. I'm, definitely I have been talking about apprenticeship is dealing with arborists, training people how to become arborists, how to do tree management. People just don't understand. They look at trees as a vector instead of as a plus. So again, that's where that whole educational piece come in. So I just wanted to share that, we can't forget about that and how we disseminate this information to our communities. I think it's so critical across all sectors of what we're doing. We're talking about climate change.
Thank you. Our next question is for Secretary Redding. This is another one from Cassie Miller of the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Secretary Redding, Pennsylvania's agriculture industry is a huge part of the economy. Does the Department of Agriculture have an estimate of the potential monetary hit to the industry and the economy could take from climate change? And how does the department reach out to Pennsylvania farmers to discuss the climate best practices you referred to? How are those outreach efforts received by them?
Cassie, thank you. And there's a lot packed inside of that list. Let me start with just the impact and sort of a confirmation of your observation. Agriculture in the state's about $132 billion based on our last study with the Fox School of Business just released last week, 590,000 jobs. So to your point, it is significant. In terms of the outreach and getting the agricultural community engaged, I would say a couple of things. One is, and I would just preface this by saying that it's unfortunate that the word climate and change have been politicized, right? Because I think in the agricultural community, we've got a very intimate relationship with the climate, right? It's what we do. It impacts every single crop that we plant here. It dictates our calendars from start to finish, and of course ultimately impacts our economy. And in many respects, agriculture is in the business of managing carbon. That is also what we do, right? I mean, the photosynthesis cycle and building carbon and making sure that we're capturing that carbon. So I think the to your point, the engagement of the agricultural community is critical. And having them feel like they are, as I mentioned in the comments, there's a major opportunity here to shape not just what they do, but shape the direction of our climate resiliency in the state. That does require two things. One, I think recognizing that the practices that farmers have been applying for years as part of the best management practices for water quality are also the same good best management practices for climate resiliency, right? And we have, to this point, sort of talked about those practices in one dimension. So to your point, I think spanning this out a bit to include both the climate, the soil health, the water quality, the stacked and tiered benefits of good management practices and the stewardship of the environment ultimately benefit us in so many ways, to include climate. Final point is that I think as we get better at talking about climate is in the agricultural communities, to make sure that we don't think about this in one dimension, right? This is not about just the climate. It's climate and health, it's climate and food production, it's climate and rural development, it's climate and conservation, it's climate and research. I think how we frame this question becomes a really critical step in whether we engage and have engaged the agriculture community, and whether they stay engaged in that conversation. We need them there. Ultimately, what we do in the soil and the land is a major impact of what happens with climate change, right? And the cover crops, the soil health, the conservation work, we get them to do that. Then I think we've got a really strong case to make that there's both an economic benefit to them, there's an environmental benefit to them, but that requires us to really think pretty comprehensively and holistically about our discussions of climate in Pennsylvania and the farm community and how they can be a part of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. And I would like to thank everyone who participated this afternoon. We are going to close things out now. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, both here on WebEx and on Facebook. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope you all have a very nice day. As always, more information on climate change can be found on DEP's website. The Secretary mentioned it earlier. It's www.dep.pa.gov/climate, CLIMATE. Thank you all.